So without further ado, here's Andrew Burleson.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out. There's a few seats up here in the front. I don't know if you guys in the back want to squeeze in, but we're going to be going really fast. Jim, thanks for the introduction, because it's always weird introducing yourself, so I'll just skip that part. Can everybody hear me all the way to the back? Fine? Okay. So we're going to talk about a bunch of ideas today. And these ideas, when you stick them all together, form a framework. And the reason that this framework is useful is because it helps you to recognize patterns between the way that things are built and what things are worth. And so we're going to cover a lot of things. It's going to be, in some ways, information overload, but I'm going to try and make it interactive. I don't have a panel with me to discuss this, so you guys are going to be my panel today. We're going to use some audience participation to hopefully make it a little more interesting. And so I'm going to need you guys to just be willing to participate, because that's going to be really critical to making this work. So also, I apologize in advance. Something about the corner here feels weird to me, so I'm going to pace a lot, I can tell already, so I'll try not to be too distracting. But the first thing I need is a volunteer. Just any volunteer will do. Anybody. Somebody raise your hand. All right, stand up, please. All right, what's your name?
Dan.
Dan? What's your favorite color?
Well, actually, it's shifted. Dark brown.
Brown?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's all we needed. Appreciate it, Dan. Okay, that's the kind of questions we're going to ask. Well, it won't be all about colors, but we're going to ask questions where there's no right or wrong answer. I just want your gut reaction. Don't overthink it. Just whatever comes to mind is the right answer. There's no way you can be wrong. So that's the kind of participation we're going to do. It should be real easy. It should be real fun. Now, out of curiosity, I've given this talk a couple times now. Was anybody at the Texas APA and saw this? Okay, good. So if you were here for Texas APA, you would be tempted to cheat and shout out answers to questions, and you shouldn't do that. But since you weren't there, you guys have no hope, so it's great. We're going to start by talking about economics. Is anybody an economist in here? How about a banker or financial analyst? Okay, one guy. So he knows a little bit about money. The rest of you guys, this should hopefully be good. This should be information that you kind of know, or you probably think you kind of know, but you maybe haven't really ever thought about it very hard before. So we're going to try and think about it a little bit, because it's going to be really important as we start to look at examples later. These basic economic principles really need to be in your head to understand kind of what the conclusions I'm going to be drawing from the examples we're going to look at. Whenever you start talking about economics, professors like to talk about supply and demand, and they like to talk about this chart. Does anybody know what this chart means? Okay, awesome. This chart is dumb. I don't like it. I think it's more interesting to talk about ice cream. So if you don't know, this is Bluebell mint chocolate chip ice cream. This is the very best ice cream in the entire world. There's no other ice cream that's even close to as good as this ice cream, right? So I think that's awesome. But we're going to just imagine for a minute here that there's been a Bluebell apocalypse. And there's only one of these, actually no, there's two. There's two of these half gallons left in the whole world. And I have both of them, right? So I'm keeping one for myself, sorry. But I'm going to be generous and let you guys have the other one. Well, but there's like 100 or so people in this room. So we need to figure out. So if I was giving you a half gallon of Bluebell mint chocolate chip for free, how many of you would like to maybe have it? Just raise your hands. Okay, everyone who doesn't have your hands up, you need to see me after class, because this is amazing. All right, so everybody who's interested for free, raise your hands again. Okay, well, so that's kind of a lot of people, right? We need a fair way to figure out who gets the ice cream, right? Because this is too good to share it. You can't share it. So I think we're going to need to figure out, would it be fair? Do you guys think it'd be fair if we said the person who wants it most should maybe be the person who gets it? So who wants this ice cream the most? If you want this ice cream the most in this room, raise your hand. Well, how do you guys know? I mean, really? There's like 5 people who just told me they want it the most. So this isn't very good. Okay, well, I have an idea. If you said you want this ice cream the most, keep your hand up for a minute. So you guys need to like maybe show me how much you want it, right? So I think what we should do here is we should have a little auction, right? All of you have money. Money is a representation of value. It's a representation of work that you've done, you did in order to earn that money. So let's see, if you want this ice cream the most, let's see how much the most you want it, right? Does that make sense? So if you still had your hand up, would you still want it for $5? Just hands up, if you still would love to have this ice cream for $5. All right, 10, 15, 20. And we have a winner.
That was cheap.
Yeah, right? For the last ice cream in the world? You guys are crazy. So you can just give me that $20 at the end.
We're gonna steal it from you. You just gotta try.
That's supply and demand. Okay, that's how supply and demand works. We have a supply of one tub of ice cream, and in this room, when we got the price up to $20, we wait, was it 15 or 20? I already forgot.
I think it was only 15.
Oh yeah, it was funny. Yeah, when we got the price up to $20, we only had one person who still would be willing to pay for that ice cream. So our demand was one, our supply was one, and the price is what brings those two things into balance. Okay, price is a representation of worth. It's the same thing as value. They're identical ideas. And when you price something correctly, then you end up with an equal number of units of supply and people who would like something. And it's really interesting to look at this. People a lot of times think, well, something's that's overpriced, or I don't know, I don't want it. But if you think about it, really, if I had tried to give this ice cream away for free, right? We didn't have a good way to figure out who gets it. Right? And if I said I'll give it for $5, well then I still have to pick one person. Maybe we do first come, first serve. That would have left like 7 or 8 other people who were kind of mad because it's like, man, I wanted that. I would have totally paid $5 for it, but they didn't get it. Right? So by raising the price, you're basically allowing people to self-select and decide what they want. So supply and demand determine price. Another way of saying this exact same thing that I think is really important to hold in your minds, how many of you guys are planners or designers of some kind? Okay, so planners and designers, and I have an architecture undergrad, so I'm totally in that world. We tend to be like, man, demand is getting us down, like everything's too expensive, But another way of thinking of this that I think makes a little more sense if you're more on the creative side of the brain is to say that availability against desirability is equal to value, right? And this is exactly the same meaning. These two things are identical in meaning. Supply and demand determine price. Availability and desirability determine value. That economically means exactly the same thing. But if you think about it in reality or in real life terms, it's a little easier sometimes to see that, so an iPad costs however much, and there's only so many that they can make, and so they price it a certain amount. There's loads and loads and loads of people. If you said, would you like an iPad for $20? They'd be like, of course, give it to me. Right, but Apple can't they're already selling more than they can make in the first place, so they're already probably underpricing by a little bit anyway. It's the combination of something being very desirable and then how much it's available is what determines what it's actually worth. So we're going to try and look at 2 examples of how that plays out in the marketplace. The first thing we're going to look at is coffee. How many people in this room like coffee? Like really like coffee? Yeah, awesome. Everybody likes coffee, right? So coffee is pretty desirable, right? There's high demand, high desirability. Okay, well, these are coffee Arabica beans. I don't know if I said that right, but whatever. These are beans like they freshly plucked off of whatever kind of plant a coffee plant is, and I don't remember if it's like a tree or a bush or something, but anyway, they grow on something. And when you pluck them off, they look like this, and nothing has really been done to them yet. They haven't been seasoned or roasted or spiced. There's this other coffee called Robusta. That's not as good. We're not talking about that stuff. This is coffee Arabica. This is the good stuff, okay? But it's in its raw, non-Starbucks form, okay? So I need to get 4 volunteers. So just stand up. If you're willing to be guinea pig, just stand up. 1, 2, 2 more, 3, 4. Perfect. Thank you. All right, everybody give her a round of applause for our volunteers. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys, we're gonna do an experiment. I'm in the market for a pound of these coffee beans, and we're going to figure out how much I should pay, okay? Now, you guys all have these beans. All your beans are exactly the same. And I'm going to give you a hint. It costs you $2 to produce a pound. So every pound that you have on your store shelves costs you $2 to get it there, all right? So, you, sir, what's your name?
Todd.
Todd, how much would you be willing to sell me a pound of your beans for?
$2.50.
$2.50, all right. What's your name?
Nadia.
Nadia, what do you say?
$4.
$4? You're out. All right, what's your name?
I think about 10.
About $10? Well, you're out too. I'm sorry, what was your name?
Al.
Al, thanks Al. What's your name?
Who are you? Are you Starbucks? Or are you?
No, I'm just me. I just make beans. I'm like a home
My
enthusiast
Robbie?
roaster. I'm
Robbie?
such an enthusiast. I know what kind of plant these
Let's
grow
say
on.
$4.
$4? boy, you guys are silly. This guy just offered me $2.50. Why would I buy your beans? He's offering me $2.50 for the beans.
Well,
Does
$3.
anybody? Oh, $3. All right, so $3. Does anybody want to make a final counter offer? Right? Anybody? Anybody?
359.
You keep going up. Why would I? Oh, $2.50.
No, 350. No, I walk away.
She says $2.49. What's your name? Chandra? All right, Chandra just emerged into the market. She's a Brazilian coffee supplier, and she just got my business because she's a penny cheaper, right? Those beans are beans. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do whatever I want from here on out. They'll become different, but now at this point, all your beans are the same to me. So $2.49 is the winner. So that's how much they would be worth in this room. So thank you all very much for participating. It turns out that in the open market, these are worth actually about $2.26. That was like a month or two ago, the last time I looked this up. It swings, so it's not that exact number today, but it's close. So, the reason is that these are worth this is because even though there's really high demand for beans, there's lots of people who have these. They're all basically the same. And so whoever's willing to sell them for the lowest price is going to sell the most. And everybody else has to sort of juggle, how close can they get to that minimum before they, aren't making enough money. So that's what's really controlling the price in this case, or the value, which is the same thing in this case. So here's another thing. Let's find out what something else is worth. This is Jackson Pollock number 5. Now, this is some pretty famous modern art. How many people in this room really like modern art? I mean, like really like it. 2. So coffee is much more popular in this room than modern art. Okay, but I mean, this is unique. There's only one of these. So, maybe this is worth as much as coffee, despite it not being as popular. I don't know. Let's try and find out. Let's do a little auction here. We're going to do an art auction. We'll pretend that I somehow own this painting, and I'm strapped for cash, and we're on an island, and you're the only people on the island. But otherwise, you're your same selves with your same actual monetary resources, okay? So how many people would be willing to pay $1,000 for this? Just hold your hands up in the air until we get to a price you're not interested anymore. Okay, so $1,000, $2,000. 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 25, 27, 30, 35, 40. Just go ahead and put your hand down. 40,000! Jim wins! Okay, so $40,000. $40,000 for this painting. Like, all your kids could have done this, right? Hey, Jim. So I have this in my car, and afterwards you can just write me a check, and we'll take care of it. So we got $40,000 for this painting. How many people in this room think this painting is worth $40,000? Just looking at it as a piece of art, as a piece of paper with paint squiggles on it. Is it really worth $40,000? Okay, a few people say yes. Is it worth more than $40,000? How many people say it's worth less than $40,000? Yeah, a bunch of you aren't decided. You're the only ones who are wrong here, right? Everything is worth what its purchaser will pay for it. That's kind of a famous adage here. And it turns out that the last time that this was on sale, it went for a lot more than $40,000. So why would that be? Anyone want to make a guess?
The artist.
One of a kind.
It's rare, it's one of a kind. Well, what about just on a more practical level?
There's other people in the world who have more resources than people in this room.
There, Zach just said it. There's a lot of other people in the world who have more resources than the group gathered here in this room. So the last time this was on the market, Sotheby's Corporation was advertising it and making it available to the entire world to potentially purchase. And as I recall, the purchaser was a Russian guy, and he paid $140 million for this. Yes. That makes this the most expensive painting ever sold. Okay, so it's kind of a big deal, right? I would not pay that much. I would sell it for that much. So we looked at 2 different types of products. We're still talking about supply and demand, but we end up with 2 different kinds of things, right? There are things that are commodities like beans, where beans are beans are beans, and there's things that are differentiated where one is not the same as the other. They're more unique. And if it's totally unique, then the demand is basically going to be determining the value. If it's totally generic, the availability is basically, or supply is basically determining value. And that's really important. Most things in the world of consumer products or personal property fall somewhere in between, right? This iPad is not totally unique. It's the older model, not the newer model, so it's not quite as good, whatever. But, there's only so many available. And like a Kindle is not the same as an iPad. It has some similarities, but it's not an exact substitution. So you can't just say that that anybody who would buy an iPad would also substitute a Kindle 100% of the time. That's not true, and that's why iPads are worth more. So just try and keep this in your head. Prices and value are the same thing. Supply and demand work this way. We're going to get more into that and how it applies to property and places later. There's one more thing that we need to understand, which is a little different. This is time value of money. How many people are already familiar with time value of money? Okay, so a few. That's good. Well, what you're asking about with time value of money is pretty straightforward. It's how much would money be worth today versus money tomorrow, or money at some other point in time, right? Money right now versus money in the future. The basic principle here is that money is worth more now than it is later, even if it was the same amount of money. $1,000 today is worth more than $1,000 tomorrow. So why would that be? Anybody?
It's participation in the economy can grow.
Yeah, you could grow. It could do something with it, right? Like if I put this in just my, savings accounts aren't that good anymore, but even if I just put that $1,000 in my savings account today, I'd get like half a penny more, right? So by tomorrow I'd have 1,000 and half a cent, and you'd be only giving me 1,000 otherwise, right? So it's worth more. It's easier to think about it in more extremes, right? Like which is worth more to you, $1,000 today or $1 million in 100 years? Yeah, right? Like none of us are that confident we're going to be around to collect the million in 100 years. So even though $1 million is clearly worth more than 1,000, it's not worth more if you're never going to get it, right? So that's the principle of time value of money. So it's harder. The reason that this formula is how you calculate, or it's one of the ways you calculate it, and the reason it's really important is because sometimes it's not easy to tell. So here's a quick question for you. Would you rather have $1,000 today or $100 a year for 15 years? And we're going to assume that your alternative investment, for those who already know what this is the historical average of the stock market, so 10%. Okay, so how many people would rather have $1,000 today? Okay, it's about half. How many would rather have $100 a year for 15 years? A bunch of people are indecisive still. You guys are going to have to start. There's a participation grade here. Come on, guys. All right. If you plug this all into the formula, this is the formula for the present value of an annuity, and if you sub the numbers in, you find out that $1,000 right now is worth $1,000. $100 a year for 15 years is worth $760 right now. And what that means is that if you took that $100 a year every year and you just put it into your alternative investment, in this case being the average of the stock market over history, then by the end of 15 years, you have the same amount of money as if you had just taken $760 right now and stuck it in the stock market and just left it sitting there. Okay, so those is the same, right? So now when you're looking at 1,000 versus 760, obviously if you did the same thing, took that $1,000 and just stuck it in the stock market right now, you'd end up with more than if you stuck $760 in the stock market, assuming the historical average had any relevance in the future, which may be up for debate. But that's time value of money. Does everybody feel comfortable that they understand at this point price, supply and demand, time value of money, how those things work? Anybody have any urgent nagging questions before we move on? Okay, so let's start connecting this to property. When you look at things in economic terms, and don't have a crash, we'll get back in just a second. When you look at things in economic terms, it turns out that there are fundamentally two different kinds of land. There's rural and urban land. Okay, so rural is, stuff like this. Urban is stuff like this. And there's an important difference between the two. Rural land is valued based on what it produces, whereas urban land is based on what's going to occupy it. And so basically rural land acts like a commodity in the market, and urban land acts like a differentiated product. Urbanization, when rural land becomes urban, that happens when the discounted value of development is greater than the discounted value of resource production. Rural land, you're valuing it based on, I'm going to grow so much corn, and that corn is worth so much money. So that's the value of the land, right, is what it's making. Versus urban land, I could sell a house here for X dollars, that's what the land is worth. So urbanization happens when the value of what you could sell it for is more than what you could make from it. To give you an example of how this works, this is really, especially for, how many are planners again? Okay, good chunk. This is really important for planners to understand. Let's look at an example of a 1 acre corn farm. So the average yield of corn in America is about 161 bushels an acre. The corn price, again, as of about a month ago, the last time I changed these numbers, is $6.05 a bushel. So if we figure that we're going to get 161 bushels at $6.05 a bushel, that comes out to be $9.74 and 5 cents per harvest per acre. Now, there's some cost of producing that corn, right? We're going to assume, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I'll tell you why it's my guess in a minute. We're going to assume that farmers make a 40% profit margin, or you could say that it costs them 60% of what they're going to earn just to produce that income. So at a 40% margin, that's a $389 profit per year per acre. So how much is that worth in total dollars, right? All the future harvests. How much do you suppose all those future harvests over the whole rest of time would be valued at? Well, we can solve for that. We can calculate the present value of a growing annuity. And I say it's growing because I'm going to assume that this is going to keep pace with inflation over time, that the value of corn will be roughly constant. That may not be true, but for our purposes, that's an assumption we need to make. So if we sub the numbers in, we find out that this $389 per year income stream, keeping pace with inflation for all of time, is worth $5,566 today. So in other words, the farm is worth $5,500 an acre, which is the same thing as 13 cents a square foot. So if a developer offers a farmer more than $5,566 an acre, he should sell, because the value the developer is giving him right now is worth more than the value of all the future harvests he's ever going to collect on that land. Does that make sense? And this is really the hard math that you're dealing with. If I would assume the majority of this audience likes the idea of preserving rural countryside and farmland, right? All of us like that because it's beautiful and we'd love to go out and experience it, right? But this is kind of a hard math. $5,000 an acre is not a lot of money. So the reason I made my guess of a 40-cent margin is because I see around Texas that $6,000 an acre seems to be the starting point where farmland begins to sell. That's not a purely scientific number. That's just based on my experience looking at these things. And so I kind of backed into that. I guess maybe farmers make a 40% margin because if they did, that's about what their land would be worth. So you can see if your land is worth $5,500 an acre, hey, 6,000 an acre sounds like a good deal, right? This is what drives urbanization. And what happens is developers are going to offer that money whenever they think they can build something on the land that's going to be either rented or sold, and it's going to make more money than what it costs them to buy the land, build it, and operate it. So this is urbanization. It's the difference between urban and rural land, and it's an important distinction because whatever we're going to talk about today is not about character. This audience may not care too much about this. I'm very involved with the Congress for the New Urbanism. That group likes to talk a lot about character of development, and they will say things like, well, this may be out in the woods, but it's very, suburban in character, or it's urban in character, and that may be true. That's one way of looking at things. But from an economic perspective, land is either one of these two. It's either rural or it's urban. And so we just looked at how to value rural land. We value urban land differently, and let's look real quick at how we do that. Before I go on from that, does anybody have any pressing, urgent questions? I'll stop usually when we go from one idea to the next. Just because if you guys get really, really lost, I'd rather catch you up now. We're not going to have a lot of time for discussion at the end, so we'll try and incorporate questions as much as we can as we go. So the second idea is to look at how we value urban land. Real property is unique, at least because it only occupies one unique space on the planet, right? There's no way that you can copy the exact physical location of another piece of property. So at least in that way it's unique. But it's also unique because of its relationship to the other pieces of property around it. So that's where the old adage, location, location, location comes from, right? The biggest characteristic of urban land is where it's sitting. This means that basically the supply of any piece of land is one. There's no other land that's no other urban land that's economically substitutable for this piece of land. And because supply is approaching basically one, the demand is going to mostly determine the price. So you can think of this in terms of location demand, or the demand of people to be at a specific place. You can think of that as attraction. I like to call it attraction. The more people who are attracted to a particular piece of land, the more value that it's going to be. Because that means you're going to have more people who would be potentially willing to compete with their dollars for the right to occupy it. So let's try and look at how this works. Let me give you guys two questions. First, this is a house. This is like a I think it was about a 3,000 square foot house. Is this a good deal at $100 a square foot, $300,000? What do you think? How many people say this is a good deal? Yeah, it depends on the location, right? We have no idea. Where is it? I think that's in West Virginia. I'm not sure I remember. So we don't know, right? We don't know. Does anybody feel totally confident they do know? Okay. I mean, we don't know. What about this building right here, the one that's popped in red? How about that for $100 a foot? Is that a good deal? That's about $2 million. Yeah, it's a good deal. Wait a minute. How do you guys know?
Because we know where it is.
So y'all know where this is? You recognize this picture? This is Times Square, come on. Okay, according to the Times Square Merchant Association, something like 10 million people per day see Times Square either in person or on TV, and 1.5 million of those are actually pedestrians walking across the square itself. And then when you factor in all the other media appearances throughout the year, things like the New Year's party and everything else, it's closer to like 3 billion people every year see Times Square, right? So it's almost half the world is familiar with Times Square, right? That's a lot of attraction power. And so as it turns out, land around Times Square almost never sells, but the last thing I was able to find sold for about 10 to 15 times this price. It sold for about $2,000 to $3,000 a square foot, which is pretty astronomical. That meant that a one-bedroom condo, which was the last one I saw that was right on the square, was like a one-bedroom condo. It was about 800 square feet and sold for about $4 million. So that's pretty incredible, but that's because everybody in the world is aware of this place and might potentially like to be there. So that's how attraction works. So attraction is the basis of urban property values. So if we kind of understand attraction is what's determining values, it might be helpful to understand what things are determining attraction. So we're going to look at that. And so I got another question for you guys. We're here in San Antonio. There's another city with a similar name, San Francisco. It's a very different place from San Antonio, but they both have strengths and weaknesses, of course. So you guys pick one. How many people say San Antonio? You know, to live in, to be the place you want to live and work and everything. I'm sorry, my bad. All right, San Antonio. How many people say San Francisco? That's interesting. You know, I asked this question in Austin. I said Austin or Boston, and everybody in Austin was like, Austin! So, two things. People in San Antonio aren't quite as loyal, and California is cooler than Massachusetts. So we're divided. So somebody who said San Antonio, I need a volunteer. Who said San Antonio? So what are some reasons? Just give me one reason.
Property values, quality of life.
Okay, property values, quality of life. What about quality of life?
Well, you've got great entertainment. It's low, easily accessible.
You think you have better entertainment than San Francisco? I'm not trying to say which one is right. I'm just asking.
Maybe I have less population density.
You like lower population density? Okay, cool. So what are some other reasons? What were some other reasons you might pick San Antonio over San Francisco? Just anybody shout out a reason.
It's cheaper.
Taxes, cheaper food. I heard
No earthquakes.
no earthquakes. Good. These are good. These are good. Anybody have anything else that's different? Hasn't been shouted out yet?
Good beer.
Good beer. Close to Austin. Okay. And it's in Texas. Yeah. Okay. What about San Francisco? What are some reasons we might pick San Francisco? Anybody? Food again.
Ocean view.
Ocean view. Culture.
Earthquakes.
Earthquakes. Which one do you think is prettier?
San Antonio.
San Francisco.
I don't know. See, it's different. Okay. Well, so what's interesting is you guys all. Thank you very much for shouting your ideas out. You all gave me different reasons, and what's interesting is that your reasons all fell into one of 4 categories. We're responding when we think about places we want to be. We're responding to 4 environments. We're responding to the natural environment, the economic environment, the social environment, and the built environment. We said things like, it's cheaper, I like the culture, I like the food, I like the weather, I like the earthquakes, I like the lack of earthquakes. Okay, these things all come into these categories. And basically, this is what we subconsciously perceive and think about and are influenced by in our daily lives. Right now, a lot of people live in San Antonio and are very happy, and a lot of people live in San Francisco and are very happy. So they're both right. But what's interesting is the fact that the prices in San Francisco are 5 or 10 times higher indicates that out of the world as a whole, more people find San Francisco desirable than San Antonio. That's just what the economics says. That doesn't mean that people who love San Antonio want to be the rest of their life are wrong. No, they're right. It's a good place for them. But the relative market value, what that's telling you is out of the population as a whole, what are people's preferences, right? New York is the only place in America more expensive than San Francisco because it's the only place in America that economics tells us is higher or more desirable than San Francisco to more people, right? So the interesting thing is you get kind of polarized, right? There's a lot of people who hate New York, but it doesn't matter because the people who love it are so crazy they'll spend ridiculous money anyway. So that's just how that works in economic terms. There's one other really important distinction here. When we talk about the natural and the built environment, the natural environment, we're talking about, this kind of stuff, spontaneous ecology. When we talk about the built environment, we're talking about this kind of stuff, man-made stuff, right? But we're also talking about this kind of stuff. Okay? This is also built. These little crops here do not grow in these little perfect rows naturally. They happen to be spaced correctly for tractor tires. That would be a neat trick, but they don't. So we're talking about basically the spontaneous ecology, or the God-made world, if you will, versus managed environments, or the man-made world, however you want to think of that. Now, there's 4 environments, but they're all inseparably interconnected. You can't pull one apart from the others. They all are intimately related. They influence each other, and they influence us, and we influence them. And it turns out that these 4 environments are always either attracting us to or repelling us away from a place. And it might be things where one is attracting and the other is repelling, right? Okay, the ocean view in San Francisco, very attractive. The earthquakes, not so attractive, right? So those things all kind of balance out. What's interesting is to see how this interaction happens between the 4 environments and us. Because there ends up being a really important distinction. And this is our next idea. The distinction is this. The first 3 environments, the natural, economic, and social environment, are indirect in their relationship to us. The built environment is direct. And what I mean by that is this. The natural environment, we don't have one-to-one control, right? We influence it. But things like, if you want to see a perfect example of how we don't have control, go on Wikipedia and read rabbits in Australia, okay? We don't really control ecology. We interact with it, but it very literally has a mind of its own and does its own things that we're not always expecting and are very frequently surprised by. You could say our relationship with the natural environment is maybe best described as unintended consequences. Okay? The economic environment. If there was some lever that President Obama could go to push and the unemployment rate would go down, he would do it, right? There isn't. So he can do lots of things, but even with all of his influence, all he can do is sort of give things a little nudge and hope that it all trickles through in such a way that the economy gets better. There's not a direct relationship. The same thing with the social environment. We all participate in that. Some of us are wearing one kind of clothes today. Some of us are wearing other kinds of clothes. Over 100 years, fashions will change based on all the little decisions that we all made. But nobody gets to sit and pick and say, you know what? In 100 years from now, this is going to be the way we dress and make it happen. It just doesn't work that way. Even though some people do have a lot of influence, no one person controls the outcomes. What's interesting is the built environment is different. The built environment doesn't have a mind of its own. And it isn't the result mostly of interhuman interactions, the way the social and economic environments are. And also, the social and economic environments are intangible, whereas the built environment is tangible. There's nothing that exists that was man-made that got there spontaneously. Somebody made it, right? Somebody, maybe the same person, maybe someone else, decided that it should be made and what it should be like. Okay? Now, there's varying degrees of thought that go into this. There's a lot of people who will pitch a tent in the woods. That's a built environment in a way. It's a very tiny one, a very low impact one, but that's a built space. Then you have people who build monuments, right? That's very different. That's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. But both of those got there through an act of human will, and neither one of them could exist apart from that. And that's what exposes that we have this direct environment, or this direct interaction. So when we talk about attraction and the influence of these places on us, I like to think of it as this. We have the indirect attraction, the things that we cannot directly control, and we have direct attraction as a distinctly different kind of attraction. All interrelated, but different in the way we interact with them. And if you take the sum of those two, you get net attraction. And that's what I've called this framework, this way of looking at things. Net attraction is basically the same thing as property value. But it's just a different way of understanding how you got to that value. And what's really interesting, what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about, is direct attraction. Because direct attraction, or the built environment, this is our chance to change the equation. This is our chance to do something that's going to make a difference. Everything else we do matters, but we don't have any other opportunity to directly, concretely get a one-to-one result the way we do with the built environment. So at this point, before we keep going, are there any urgent nagging questions?
Let me just ask everybody to hold a piece of paper, fan it a little bit, let's get the air moving. Serious. Move the air.
Sure. Apparently this session is so good you can't escape. There we go. All right. So if we understand that the built environment is our chance to change the equation, then it might be helpful to dig into the built environment and see what can we do, how does it work. So it turns out that you can group everything in the built environment into one of these three categories: cores, interfaces, and conduits. And there's a real simple example to illustrate what these are. Okay, conduits are fixed pathways for movement. Cores are private space, private realm. And interfaces are publicly visible and accessible spaces. Or you could say they're the spaces in between, the connective tissue between cores, conduits, cores and other cores. The interface is the space in between that's publicly visible and accessible. The reason this example is so useful is because it doesn't matter whether it's publicly or privately owned, and it doesn't matter whether it's inside or outside. Okay? Interior space is almost always, like 99.9% of the time, is going to be core. But outside space could be too. The backyard is certainly not publicly visible and accessible. If someone was traipsing through your backyard, you have a problem with that, right? If someone traipses through your front yard, you may not like it very much, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're up to no good, right? Your front yard is public. Even though you own it, even though it's private space, the people can pass through that in a very public way. There's a tricky distinction that you need to make sometimes between conduits and interfaces. In the case of streets, sometimes it's hard to tell. Here's an example that's pretty easy that makes it a little simpler. If a place is safe to hang out in, then it's an interface. If it's not safe to hang out in, it's a conduit. This is in Barcelona. You see those pedestrians over here are clinging for dear life to this curb, right? And the only person brave enough to stand out in this bus lane here was me to take this picture. But I had to jump back out of the way real quick to not get run over. And y'all are glad, right? Because I'm here. So this is a bus lane that's a conduit, okay? This is another bus lane that's an interface. You see this person here is just hanging out, has no qualms whatsoever, just to chill out in this space. This is the Denver 16th Street Mall. This is a great human space. Buses are allowed to pass through, right? So the presence of motorized vehicles and things like that does not determine whether something's a conduit or an interface. What determines is whether it's a safe public space for people to inhabit and enjoy. If it is, it's an interface. If it's not, then it's probably a conduit of some kind. Okay, so the built environment is made of these three things, and we use these to create or manipulate attraction. So if we're using these three things, why group them into these three categories, right? What difference does it make? Well, the reason it makes a difference is because they affect attraction differently. And this is where the framework starts to get real interesting. I hope you weren't bored yet, because we're hopefully going to get more exciting, more information here. When you think of things this way, you start to see certain patterns, and this is where I began to be interested in this and began to sort of go down this road of trying to figure it out in the first place. I'm going to show you two streets. These are a couple blocks apart. This first street is, this is all the examples are from Houston. I'm going to pick on Houston because it's my town, and so I feel like I have a little ownership, and also because the people there, if they get mad at me, I'll probably be able to actually see them and maybe buy them a beer and make it up to them. Whereas if I ragged on San Antonio, you guys would all just hate me and never invite me back. So we're going to talk about Houston. So this is a street. The houses here are pretty new. They're pretty nice, actually. They're valued at $100 a foot, okay? This is another street. This is about 2 blocks away. The houses on this street are actually much older, although the one that's poking out from the trees is new, so that kind of makes me always look like a liar when I say that. But these are all old houses on this street, many of which are actually in need of severe repair or attention. But consistently down this street, the appraisal is pretty close to $165 a foot. So that's about 65% more value. That's a lot more value. So what's the difference? You guys see any difference? Yeah, the trees, the sidewalks, the overhead wires. Okay, all right, we're starting to see something here. Here's another example. I think this one's even more poignant. This is in Montrose, which is my neighborhood I live in Houston. This is a 3,000 square foot red brick box built in the early 1930s. It appraises at $75 a foot. Okay, this is the character of the block it's on. This is 1,500 feet away, which is 6 short blocks. Another 3,000 square foot red brick box built in the early 1930s. It appraises at $140 a foot. That's double the value. And this is the character of the block that it's on. Okay, so we're starting to see something here. Now, this is interface. The interface here is a lot better than the interface here, right? Everybody kind of intuitively understand that? This is not rocket science, this is pattern recognition, right? So yeah, we see it. Double the value though, that's a big deal. You don't get double the value within that kind of proximity very often. These people are going to the same stores, they're sending their kids to the same school, you know, they probably go to the same church and hang out in the same places. These are people who live in very close proximity to each other, and one person has decided that their house was worth twice what the other one was worth in close proximity. You have a nagging question?
Yeah, I mean, there's also the issue of relationship beyond the core, from one element of the built environment to the next. You're talking about every single cell, every single unit, but if those two are across the street from each other, would they be averaging out, or do they all go to the lowest common
That is
denominator?
a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question, and we're going exactly that direction,
Okay.
so we'll keep going. But yeah, but this is, and there's another point, which is what I was kind of wondering if you were going to bring up, is that you guys know when you shop for a house, if it looks great on the outside but it's crappy on the inside, that affects the value too, right? But it's not only the interface that matters. So this stuff, this is pattern recognition. The reason it's pattern recognition is because as much as I've tried to put perfect numbers to it, you kind of can't. It falls under a branch of math that's called complexity theory, which is to say that there's so many variables that you can't perfectly predict and you can't perfectly control for all of them, so you can't create a perfect equation that will always describe the exact outcome. But what you can do is see a consistent pattern that emerges that gives you an indication of the direction things will go, right? And that's what we're going to talk about. What happened in this case is that in 1930, these places were worth about the same, right? They were built for the same customer. But over time, this block invested in interface. They invested in making the block nicer, and the other block didn't. And so over time, one block got a little nicer, and then you changed owners, right? At this point, this block's a little nicer. You get an owner with a little bit more income. You get a next owner with a little bit more income, and a little bit more income, and so on. And so over time, everything about these properties on this street becomes nicer, including the core. But the conduits are the same. The streets that are serving these are essentially the same street. It's not exactly the same street, but they're in the same condition, they're the same width. They're served by the same, major connectors and everything like that. But there are other differences besides just the interface, but clearly the biggest difference, because this whole block is consistently about twice the value of the other block. And the biggest visible difference is the interface. Not every house is very nice on the inside on this street. They're all about the same age. So this was one of the first patterns that I recognized that began to make me think about this and try to understand more of it. And we don't have time to go into lots and lots more of these examples, but one of the things that became evident is that there's patterns with this, and they tend to vary also based on what type of property you're talking about. So a really quick summary of this is that industrial, basically the quality of the conduits is all that really matters. With office, it's basically all about the core. Recreational spaces, those basically are interfaces, so that's really what matters. And retail and residential are sensitive to all three to a certain extent, although retail is a little more worried about the conduit and residential is a little more worried about the core, but they're sensitive to all three. So these are patterns that you can find if you go analyze, property tax rolls and things like that. These patterns begin to emerge. Another pattern that begins to emerge is that the quality of the components, or I sometimes call them manipulators because that's what they're doing, they're manipulating value. The quality of these has a different effect over distance. We just had the question, what if they go across the street from each other, would they cancel out? I think the answer is yes, they would to a certain extent equalize out quite a bit. What happens is that with cores and conduits, you have a lot of impact directly adjacent to the property. A little bit on the same block, not much at the level of the neighborhood or the city. With interfaces, you have a very significant impact over the adjacent properties, same block, and the surrounding neighborhood, and then it kind of disappears after that. The only one that's more impactful at a greater distance is, at a certain level, conduits matter more to a city and region, because it's things like an airport, which you could say is a conduit for air travel, right? Having an airport in your city makes it easier to get to the rest of the world, and to a certain extent, that increases the value of everything in that region, or within a certain distance of the airport. But it doesn't have a very strong direct effect. I mean, you can see the relative impact here. That's a relatively small impact compared to the more tangible things closer in. So the key takeaway here is that interface has got the biggest effect on surrounding property values, the stuff around a given property. And if that has the biggest effect, then maybe we want to learn more about that. So here's an example, I think, that makes the case really more clear of what difference interface can make when you're talking about projects that are very similar in other ways. So we're going to compare two apartments in Houston. One is the Post-Midtown Apartments and one is the Camden Midtown Apartments. These were both built about the same time in a similar location, and they offer similar units at similar prices. Okay, so they're basically similar in all ways except for one major difference. This is the facade at Post. This is what it looks like. This is the facade at Camden. That's what it looks like. This is how the parking garage is handled at Post. You can see it's kind of tucked away inside the building. There's a brief interruption to the sidewalk, but that's about it. This is how the parking garage is at Camden. It takes up 2 city blocks. These are the sidewalks at Post. You see they're very human-friendly. This couple was kind enough to not make me not use this picture, so that was cool. And also, this is one really interesting detail. You see these windows, and notice the heights of their heads. These windows are up about 2 feet, or the floors in these units are up about 2 feet. So even though these windows are right there on the public space, they're elevated enough that even if someone wanted to come peep in, you'd only be able to barely get your head up to the bottom of those windows, and you kind of could only see like right in their ceiling, right next to the window. So it actually provides a lot of privacy for the people who live inside, even though they're right there next to the public street. These are this is what the sidewalks look like at Camden. Now there's some interesting things here. They kept this tree, which is cool, but this is a really tiny gap. It's kind of actually hard to squeeze through there. And this, okay, everybody who grew up in the suburbs, you don't have to have grass between the sidewalk and the street. You don't have to do this. If you're in this kind of serious urban location where you're building stuff right up to the curb, quit doing this. Either make it big enough to be a planter for the trees and stuff, really supportive of the vegetation, or don't put it in to be just an obstacle to the humans, right? So take care of the plants or take care of the humans, or both, but don't half-ass it like this. Also, these windows, you notice these windows are at ground level, they're not elevated. So this fence provides a sense of privacy in a way, but like most other things, a sense of is not the same as the real thing. You can actually see directly into these units if their blinds are open. And I didn't share this picture because I was in a t-shirt and shorts that day, and I want you guys to think of me as a professional. But you can hop this fence really easily. So it's not providing the security that people think it's providing. Here's the biggest difference, though, that sums up everything in one shot. This is the leasing office at Post. It's built for people. This is the leasing office at Camden. It's built for cars. That's the difference. That's the difference. And what's interesting is what's happened in the wake of these 2 projects. They're both built about the same time in Midtown Houston, an area that was very, very, very underdeveloped, is now somewhat quickly rejuvenating, although it's taking longer than people have kind of thought it should. But there's been a lot of revitalization that's happened. What you see here, I know this is hard to digest in just a few seconds, but basically the light blue colors are places that were redeveloped after Post and Camden, the 2 anchors. And the colors around the perimeter of the block is the quality of the interface around those blocks. Okay, so what you see is Post built excellent interface. And what happened is in Houston, a city where there's no requirement to do anything like this, the people who built around Post built a pretty decent interface going out for several blocks, all except in one direction. This is a CVS, which is terrible. It's surrounded by surface parking and no sidewalks. So that's kind of a shame. But what happened is the redevelopment energy spread out like a wave. Each successive property was selling proximity to Post as a selling point. And they're selling, there's this cool environment. I didn't show you the street, but Post has two of the streets right here. Oh, get the dot come back up. Right here, where there's a bunch of retail. It's really cool retail. Over here there's like a gym and some stuff. So it's very mixed use. And these people in these other apartments and townhomes and whatnot are being sold proximity to Post. You can walk to this and it's cool, right? And it sparked this big wave of revitalization. And what tended to happen is, as long as each successive property owner continued a pretty decent interface, the redevelopment spread pretty continuously. This is now a park, not just a vacant lot. But when they didn't continue the interface, it didn't spread as far. What's interesting, Camden does not have very good interface around it, and almost no redevelopment has been sparked around Camden since it was constructed. And remember, these are comparable properties in almost every way. They're basically targeting the same people, the same budget, the same type of units. But this one sparked a bunch of revitalization and this one didn't. You want to know the icing on this cake, the saddest thing of all? You see this dot right here? That's a Houston light rail station. So this isn't supposed to happen, but it did. So our key observation here, Post is built for people, Camden is built for cars. And Post is what created more value. And especially if you're looking at it from the perspective of the public sector, it created much more value for the city because it induced successive waves of further redevelopment. So I'm going to pause for a second for a brief recap here. We've talked about so far, the main ideas we've talked about is there being 2 kinds of land, rural and urban. There being 4 environments, the natural, social, economic, and built. that operate in two ways, either directly or indirectly. And the direct attraction or built environment has three components: core, interface, and conduit, with interface being the most important for value creation, specifically at the scale of a block in the neighborhood. So that's where we've gotten so far. We've got a little bit more to kind of tie it all together and bring it back, but this is a really good spot to pause for some questions. So anybody have any quick ones? Okay, we'll do two and maybe one more if they're short.
Question about Post in Canada. Over time, has Post rental rates gone up higher than Canada?
No. And that's a very important point, because Post is not able to, okay, beans are beans, right? These units are essentially the same on the inside. Post has a small margin that they exceed the other properties. But from the perspective of public good, Post has done vastly more public good. Their money spent has resulted in vastly more public good, and they are not able to fully capitalize on that. They are not able to totally monetize their own injection of value. The people who built all around them are significantly monetizing that, whereas nobody's really got any value to monetize next door to Camden. But because there's all this area saturated with apartments, there's only a certain amount of a premium that Post can charge before people say, well, I like this better, but Camden is like way cheaper and it's just right there, and there's other apartments that have been built up since, and they all sort of keep each other's prices somewhat in check. So Post does charge a small premium, but if you compare this to another area where Post has done a lot of involvement, which is in uptown Dallas, in that area, Post involvement was reciprocated, partly because they controlled a lot more of the land, but also because other developers went along with that, and we'll get into more of those reasons in a little bit. But that lifted the value of the whole area up dramatically over the first 10, 12 years of operations, whereas Post, the value of the rent has risen, but only slightly. Our next question was over here.
You addressed minority things.
Okay, Zach?
So I just wanted to kind of maybe clarify the indirect versus direct that you have here. The sort of implication that I feel that you're saying is that we have almost total control over the direct, or over the built. But to me, I mean, like your example of fashion and the built environment are actually fairly similar. We can only build what we have the resources to do that fits within the social framework of the regulation and the market that exists.
Right.
So
there's
isn't
no
it kind of a
perfect one-to-one
subcategory?
control in a regional level for anything, right? But at the scale of the building, you can fairly simply make a decision that says, like, in this city we require landscaping, right? That kind of thing happens, right? Nobody has ever passed a law in America, at least, that says on Mondays we all wear blue, right? So there is no perfect control. And yes, each person's scope of control with the built environment or with direct attraction is limited. As a single individual, there's only so much I can do. But I could, for instance, paint my house, and in that way I've directly changed the built environment. I could maintain my facade, and in that way I've directly manipulated the built environment. I could plant shrubs and these type of things. So it's not to say that you have total control. No, not even close. You're totally right about that. You do not have total control. But you have a degree of control that you don't have in the other three. Yeah.
Was the City of Houston's Economic Development Department a key player in Post? And if not, how aware were they of the results?
Is anybody here from the City of Houston?
But he's a good guy.
But Dan, I met you. You're with bikes and stuff, right? You're about non-motorized transportation in the city, yeah?
Better.
Okay. I don't think that the City of Houston, even though they kind of do, they don't really have an economic development department. They certainly don't have an EDC or anything like that. And no, they don't tend to be very aware of anything that goes on anywhere. So that's kind of a
a
problem.
lot to the tourism and management districts.
The management district is aware. And in this case, the management district did put in a little bit of money because those streets were basically undrivable. And Post chose to allocate some of that money rather than being a developer reimbursement to put it into the sidewalks. So it's a combination of there was some infrastructure money available and how Post chose to spend it was different. Now, I think that Camden qualified for some of that same stuff, but the streets around Camden had, the street part, the car conduit had already been rebuilt. You know, you see that they put some kind of pavers, they didn't just put a straight concrete sidewalk, so they did choose to spend some money. But the difference is mostly in how they designed it, not as much as what they spent. Okay, so now we gotta keep going. We're gonna talk about another example. I'm gonna pick on Houston some more, and we're gonna talk about downtown. Specifically, we're gonna talk about the east side of downtown. This is an area that's been underdeveloped for a long time, that's beginning to change just a little bit, but it's been actually pretty shockingly severely underdeveloped. And if you want to see an example of how badly, oh dear, okay. This is in the 70s. This is all surface parking. And guys, we got about 5 or so minutes left, so I'm just going to have to blitz, and we'll maybe cheat and go like a minute late if we have to. This is downtown Houston in the 70s. This is in the 90s. By the 90s, you see they built a convention center. This is so sad. This is all late 70s. It's basically an entire city of all surface parking lots. Okay. So the city decided they wanted to take an interest in revitalizing downtown. They worked on a convention center, and through the course of the 90s and the early 2000s, they ended up building convention center hotel, basketball stadium, baseball stadium. This isn't all exclusively public money, but there was public participation throughout all of this. Okay. All these things happen, and yet if you notice, the things that were not publicly subsidized or participated in didn't really change. It's all still surface parking. Then, in the later 2000s, something changed. Let's try and see what changed. So what changed is we have this park right here. This is Discovery Green. Great park. To see the difference that Discovery Green might make, let's look at some of the things that were done before and after. These are investments before Discovery Green. This is the convention center. This is the Hilton of the Americas Hotel. What do you notice here? Yeah, these are very boring. How much do you want to hang out right in front of this place? Like, you know, if you had a mariachi band, would you want to play here? So, on the Toyota Center here, we're going to look at this. The Toyota Center, they did a little bit better. This has got a little bit going on, but it's sad because the relationship around it isn't really there. What's across the street is a parking garage. You can't see it. And what's at the end of the street, now that's an interesting opportunity. This is a terminated vista. Houston has almost a perfect block pattern. These type of interruptions that terminate the end of a street almost don't ever happen. And in other cities that know what they're doing, this is the kind of stuff they put there, right? It becomes a landmark, it creates lots of value, and it becomes something that becomes part of the imagery of your whole city. Very famously in Austin is the Capitol at the end of Congress Avenue, right? This is a very unique opportunity that doesn't happen very often. But in Houston, we did something kind of weird with it. We put our garbage docks there. Oh, okay. So I have an uncle who works for Waste Management, and I bet he thinks this is cool. But for everybody else, this sucks. So we have a problem in East Downtown, which is marketability. You have all this indirect attraction, right? We're at the middle of this major economy. We've got the cultural resources and the hub of all this activity going on, and therefore the sellers see this as value and they demand a high price, right? This land should be worth something. But the reality of direct attraction is really negative. If someone is going to potentially buy it and develop it, how are they going to get somebody to pay really, really high rent? So even though everybody might agree that the land should be worth a whole lot, if you can't charge good rent on expensive land, then you can't buy it, you can't build on it, you can't develop it, you can't make money with it. So you end up with stalemate or stagnation, which is what's been going on. So then the city did something a little different. We just talked about it a second ago. They built this park. And what they did is they spent $182 million on outstanding interface in the area. They built it and it looks like this. This is some of the sidewalks, this is some of the stuff going on in the middle, this is one of the playgrounds, and this is really exciting stuff. People come from all over the region to come here and hang out. And what's interesting is that since this was built, there's been 4 major redevelopment projects right around the park, right? These weren't happening before. So good interface changed the equation and helped get revitalization to finally start to occur. But I gotta leave you with one closing thought, which is that a park is not enough. Let me show you what I mean. This is Discovery Green again, and you see that red dot? That's a block that's 1 block off of Discovery Green. This ought to be a prime location for the second wave of redevelopment. But if you were to go to that block and you were to look to the east, this is what you would see. And if you were to look to the south, this is what you would see. And if you were to look to the west, this is what you would see. Does anybody want to guess what's on the north? Well, I have good news. It's not a parking garage, but I don't know what it is. The sad thing is the city is putting in pretty good horizontal infrastructure here, right? This is good stuff, right? But the problem is this is a people conduit, not an interface. This is the part that's missing. The vertical, there's good horizontal interface, starting to be here, but the vertical interface is terrible. This is not exciting or interesting. Nobody wants to hang out here. Nobody's attracted to be here, and therefore it isn't going to quickly redevelop. And so basically Houston is letting mediocre development wall off its big attractor. They're building a fence around it. Let me show you what I mean. This is the north side of the park. This is beautiful. This is the kind of place you want to come hang out. This is what's across the street. Now this isn't so bad. Directly facing the park, this is the new Discovery Tower. This is okay. But this site has its building and its parking garage on 2 blocks. That's 8 block faces. One of them is decent. What do the other 7 look like? How much do you want to go down that street? There's 2 blocks of this you need to walk past to go to anything else. How interested are you, if you were standing here and looking at this, how much do you feel like, I really want to go see what's 2 blocks further down, right? None. And what's sad is this is in the direction facing towards the park. So if you're trying to sell something down the street from the park as, hey, you've got this great proximity to the park, you've got to convince people that the park is so exciting that it's totally worth walking past block after block after block of this. Within a certain range, you maybe can, but at a certain point, you can't.
What is that? On the corner though?
Oh, this is the utility system for the Discovery Tower.
Probably hearing noise, you're getting.
Oh yeah, it's
cold air.
awful, and it smells weird. It's awful. But it gets worse. This is the south side of the park. And this is the brand new Embassy Suites across the street that was built after the park was completed. So when I see something like this, it just leaves me with one question. Why would they do that?
Good question.
The answer is commoditization. Remember we talked about commodities versus unique products, okay? Commoditization is the process by which you take something that was once unique and you try to simplify it, genericize it, dumb it down. It's like prescription drugs. They have a period of time where they're unique, and then they become generic, and then eventually they become Tylenol, and it's really easy to get them anywhere and cheaply, right? And everybody can make it, and there's no more patents and all that. Industrialists believe that that is the natural order of life, that that is the way things happen. At one point, the ballpoint pen was high-tech. Now it's a commodity. You can get it anywhere for a couple cents. And the American economic machine is working really hard to try and apply this principle to real estate, despite the fact that there's an intractable uniqueness to real estate that cannot be removed, which is location. You cannot get that out of the equation, and therefore you cannot actually totally commoditize it. But they're trying as hard as they can, and that's why every place looks like every other place. You try to strip down the built environment to be a totally generic system of conduits for cars and cores for people to shop in, or live in, or whatever, with nothing in between. Because that's the best way you can commoditize it. And what's interesting is that when the bank demands commoditization and the market asks for differentiation, you end up with some weird stuff, like this, which is not exactly Main Street. But it's not your normal strip mall either, sort of. Or you get this. So, let me leave you with an important conclusion. This is the main thing I want you guys to take away from this. I spelled out this whole framework because I want you to be able to walk out the door and look around and see the city in a new way. I want you to think about it differently from how you thought about it before. And the reason I want you to think about it differently is because we need to be creating economically sustainable places. And what do I mean by that? We need to get better return on our investment. This is Discovery Green. According to the people in the Discovery Green Conservancy, so far their $187 million public investment has resulted in $500 million of private investment. That's 2.67 private dollars for every public dollar. That sounds all right. If you apply the City of Houston's approximately 2.5% tax rate, they get $12.5 million of public revenue. It's not just the city. This is all public entities taxing. So this is total revenue to the public. $12.5 million a year against a total public investment of $187 gives us a 6.7% rate of return. Well, that's better than a savings account. Okay, let's compare this to a different project that had interface standards to go with it. In Portland, they built a streetcar. They spent $103 million of public investment. They got $3.5 billion of private investment, which is a 34-to-1 co-investment ratio. And at Portland's approximately 2% tax rate, that's $70 million in public revenue a year, or a 68% rate of return. So in other words, if you want to look at bang for your buck, the city of Portland got 10 times more return for their investment than the city of Houston did, because they said you can't build crappy, awful stuff next to the awesome thing that we just made, right? You've got to protect your public investment. So let me leave you with 2 things you should do about it. Number 1, more than anything, every place should be built for people first, right? Not just for cars. And number 2, when you work on trails, when you work on parks, when you work on green infrastructure projects, you need to demand that they are accompanied by interface quality standards so that value that's created by these projects can spread and bring progressive waves of revitalization across the entire area and eventually an entire city. This is totally possible, and it works in the real world, and we have thousands of years of evidence to support it. But the post-war economic machine is trying to deny it, and we can't live that way sustainably into the future. So that's my presentation. My contact information is up here. I tend to run out of business cards at these things, so please write down my email address. I would love to follow up with you all later. Our session time is up, but I'll probably be loafing around, so we can talk some more afterwards. Thank you.
a couple of questions, but before we do that, those evaluation forms that you had, and if you didn't get one, please see me, and there should be some around and some spare ones. You've got to fill that out. You can't leave without that. Literally, I'm going to be standing here. You can't leave without filling that out. Okay?
Okay, so we'll take questions until Jim says no more. So.
Go ahead.
Okay, so what, with your knowledge of the state of Texas, what cities, whether it's a combination of city departments or public-private, are doing the best at creating interface?
Dallas.
Is it economic development led or?
I don't know enough about the internal politics of Dallas to know what turned the light bulb on for them. But I would guess that it helped that they were landlocked, right? More so than the other major cities of Texas, Dallas was kind of stuck, right? They ran out of room to annex, and they needed to still grow, right? Well, they wanted to still grow at least. And so they chose to do things that would increase density, and when they began to study how to increase density, they landed on things like transit and quality infrastructure, quality interface that makes more people happy to live there. The idea is you can't drag people in and say, you have to live in a high-rise. You have to make something that's really exciting and compelling, and then people will beg to live in a high-rise. Right? But that's how it works. I think Dallas is doing the best job. I honestly don't know if it was on purpose or if it's a happy accident.
What about Austin?
Austin's doing okay. Austin is kind of anti-development, to be honest, so they make it harder on themselves than they should. There's a lot of good stuff going on in Austin, but a lot of what's great about Austin is historic. They have phenomenal resources that they started with, and I would not say that they have dramatically improved on those resources to this point, although I don't think they've made it really worse. But, for instance, the light rail project in Austin, they spent less on their light rail that's supposed to go 30 miles than Portland did on its 7-mile streetcar circulator, right? And, not surprisingly, people aren't very happy with the quality of service. So it's kind of one of those things where Austin really likes to kind of think big, but it's so bipolar. There's this kind of liberal core and this really conservative edge that really hates the liberal core, and they're not very unified about what they do and how they do it. So a lot of good stuff is happening in Austin, and I'm not really trying to say that Dallas is better than Austin, but I think in terms of the public sector, which was the original question, I think the public sector in Dallas has got a little better grip on this stuff being intentional rather than being just happening. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Would you also, I'm just curious, when you say that Post Property, they have kind of a ingrained thinking about how their properties really need to fit in with the desires of the people.
Absolutely. Yeah, Post, this is part of Post's corporate ethos. The reason Post is such a great example is that they understand this stuff and they believe in it, and they were originally started as a REIT, intended to be a vehicle for people to invest in great placemaking. And they've outperformed the market for many years, so I think they're doing well at that. Yeah, Post has a lot to do with it, and Post may be the biggest reason that Dallas really has kind of come along, is that Post happened to buy up like tons and tons of land in Dallas, whereas they only have a little bit in Houston. But Houston's also very politically different, and I don't know if Houston would have listened to Post if the situation had been reversed. I don't know. It's impossible to know that. Yeah.
Maybe I should have asked the question the first time you asked it. It was more of a fundamental question about your core environment types.
Yep.
The economic environment, you could probably say that it's unlike the other three because it's kind of a reflection of and the result of the other three. How do you treat that in your...
Well, sure. They're all inseparable and deeply interconnected, and it's a very complex relationship that you can't boil down to a simple cause and effect, single cause, single effect relationship. But I mean, in the same way, the economic environment, when people already have money, they tend to do things like move to nicer places, right? Well, then they put money into those places and make them even nicer still, right? But, places that used to be not that nice, if the community around there benefits, let's say that, the industry that's town's major industry gets better and more prosperous and brings in better jobs and everything else, the city will tend to get nicer because there's more people willing to spend money on nicer things. They're all deeply interconnected. You're right that the economic environment is an outcome, but it also is a cause. And just like the social environment is an outcome, but it also is a cause. If we have a culture of biking, we probably would do more biking, right? But just going and biking and participating in that exposes more people to it and gets us closer to having the culture of biking. So all of them are deeply interconnected. You can't pull them apart. But the major difference is that you have more tangible control over the built environment than you do over the other three. but they all 100% matter. This is something that this was something that was asked in Austin, and I always forget to put a slide about it, and I mean to every time. If your economic environment is the dumps, the nicest park in the world won't help. Okay? If you don't have any money, then nobody's going to spend any money, even if you do everything right to entice them. Okay? So the built environment won't fix the problem by itself. But when you end up with that situation that's very common in American cities, where the social and economic and natural environment are all either okay or good, and yet there's vacant lots everywhere, that's a built environment problem.
Let's go ahead and give Andrew a round of applause.
Social environment. Social environment. I think the food design, like that, is what it is.